ॐ नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय। ॐ नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय। नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय। नारायणं नमस्कृत्य नरं चैव नरोत्तमं देवीं सरस्वतीं व्यासं ततो जायमुदीरये। नष्टप्रायेषु अभद्रेषु नित्यं भागवत सेवया भगवतीरुत्तमश्लोके भक्तिर्भवती नैष्टिके। ॐ अज्ञानतिमिरन्धस्य ज्ञानाञ्जनशलाकया चक्षुरुन्मिलितं येन तस्मै श्रीगुरवे नमः। श्रीचैतन्यमनोभीष्टं स्थापितं येन भूतले स्वयं रूपकरामह्यं ददाति स्वपदान्तिकम्। नमो विष्णुपादाय कृष्णप्रेष्ठाय भूतले श्रीमते भक्तिवेदान्त स्वामीनिति नामिने। नमस्ते सरस्वते देवे गौरवाणी प्रचारिणे निर्विशेष शून्यवादी पाश्चात्यदेशतारिणे। जय श्री कृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभो नित्यानंद श्री अद्वैत गदाधर श्रीवासादि गौर भक्तवृंद। हरे कृष्णा 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 हरे हरे, हरे राम 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 हरे हरे। Hare Krishna, reading from Srimad Bhagavatam by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. We are reading from Canto 4, Chapter 28. Puranjana becomes a woman in the next life. So we are at text 13. Yavanoparuddho यतनो गस्तया कालकन्यया पूर्यां प्रज्वार संसृष्ट्य पुरपाल अन्त्वतप्यत. Translation.
The city's superintendent of police, the serpent, saw that the citizens were being attacked by Kalakanya, and he became very aggrieved to see his own residence set ablaze after being attacked by the Yavanas. Purport: the living entity is covered by two different types of bodies, the gross body and the subtle body. At death, we can see that the gross body is finished, but actually the living entity is carried by the subtle body to another gross body. The so-called scientist of the modern age cannot see how the subtle body is working in carrying the soul from one body to another. This subtle body has been figuratively described as a serpent or the city's police superintendent. When there is a fire everywhere, the police superintendent cannot escape either. When there is security and an absence of fire in the city, the police superintendent can impose his authority upon the citizens. But when there is an all out attack on the city, he is rendered useless. As the life air was ready to leave the gross body, the subtle body also began to experience pain. Hare Krishna.
Yeah. So here now, the city's superintendent of police, right? Purapalu. He is the Purapala. It is the responsibility of him to take care of the Pura, that is the city. He became very aggrieved by the attack of Kalakarnya, and he saw not only the residents are suffering, even his own house is set on the fire, and thus he was greatly aggrieved. In the purport, Srila Prabhupada explains that the living entity has two bodies, gross body and the subtle body, that we know. Just like we wear the inner wears banyan and then the outer wear shirt or trouser. Similarly, the soul is wearing first the subtle body and over that the gross body. So gross body is seen, subtle body is always subtle, mana buddhi ahankar. But this subtle body is carried to the next body, next life. As that body is trained, the subtle body is trained throughout one's life. Srila Prabhupada says that scientists are unable to understand this, but there is some progress. If you write, Dr. Stevenson, he is the very respected professor, medical professor, and he has done very extensive research on 2000 cases of authentic reincarnation, he describes. Okay. So he says there is something called a soul, but not more than that. Bhagavad Gita very beautifully explains. Kshutram chakshusparshanam cha rasanam granam cha adhisthaya manaschayam vishayan upasevate utkramantam sthitim vapi bhunjanam va gunanvitam. So the subtle body is captured and is placed to another body, and soul naturally follows the subtle body and goes to the next gross body. Now here, because the life air is experiencing the problem, pancha prana, and then subtle body is also experiencing the similar pain. Text 15, text 14. नशेके शोभितुं तत्र पुरुकृश्च उरुवे पुतुः गन्तुमैच्छत ततः वृक्ष कोटरादिव सानलात्. Translation.
Translation: As a serpent living within the cavity of a tree wishes to leave when there is a forest fire, so the city's police superintendent, the snake, wished to leave the city due to the fire's severe heat. Purport: It becomes very difficult for snakes to leave a forest when there is fire. Other animals may flee due to their long legs, but serpents, only being able to crawl, are generally burnt in the fire. At the last stage, the limbs of the body are not as much affected as the life air. Hare Krishna.
Yeah. So the prana is considered to be serpent, and just like the serpent, when there is a davanala, forest fire, it is very difficult for the serpent to tolerate that forest fire, and therefore, just like the serpent becomes aggrieved and wants to leave the cavity of the tree, similarly, the Panchaprana wanted to leave Puranjana, the city of nine gates. In the purport, Srila Prabhupada explains that the other animals, they are four-legged animals, they can jump around, and whenever there is a fire, they can quickly jump out of the fire and go away from the fire. But that is not the case with the serpent. Serpent is always scrolling, and therefore, because the serpent is, and therefore, generally the serpents are burnt into the fire. And the Panchaprana, therefore, Sanalat, Sa Analat, Anala means fire. Uh, he wanted to leave the city. Srila Prabhupada writes, at the last stage, the limbs of the body are not as much affected as the air. So, what this means is, the limbs of the body will not undergo as much suffering as the prana itself will go. And here, the prana is compared to the serpent, and the limbs are compared to the four-legged animals who can very quickly move out of the fire of the pain. Text 15. शिथिल अवयवैर्यर्हि गन्धर्वै ऋतपौरुषः यवनैरारिभिराजन् उपरुद्धोरुरोधः. Translation.
The limbs of the serpent's body were slackened by the Gandharvas and Yavana soldiers, who had thoroughly defeated his bodily strength. When he attempted to leave the body, he was checked by his enemies. Being thus baffled in his attempt, he began to cry loudly. Purport: At the last stage of life, the different gates of the body are choked by the effects of disease, which are caused by an imbalance of bile, mucus, and air. Thus, the living entity cannot clearly express his difficulties, and surrounding relatives hear the sound ghur ghur from a dying man. In his Mukundamala Stotra, King Kulashekar states, Krishna Tvadiya Padapankaja Panjaratam Adaiva.
I will recite this verse.
Yes, please.
Krishna Tvadiya Padapankaja Panjarantam Adyaiva me Vishatu Manasa Rajahamsa Prane Prayana Samaye Kafavata Pittair Kantavarodhana Vidhau Smaranam Kutaste.
So, thank you. My dear Krishna, please help me die immediately so that the swan of my mind may be encircled by the stem of your lotus feet. Otherwise, at the time of my final breath, when my throat is choked up, how will it be possible for me to think of you? The swan takes great pleasure in diving within water and being encircled by the stem of the lotus flower. This entanglement is sporting joy. If in our healthy condition we think of the lotus feet of the Lord and die, it is most fortunate. In old age, at the time of death, the throat sometimes becomes choked with mucus or blocked by air. At such a time, the sound vibration of Hare Krishna, the Mahamantra, may not come out. Thus, one may forget Krishna. Of course, those who are strong in Krishna consciousness cannot possibly forget Krishna at any stage because they are accustomed to chanting the Hare Krishna mantra, especially when there is a signal from death.
So, this is the condition of Puranjan. The limbs of the serpent's body, Shithila Avayava Yari. The Avayava became Shithila because of the constant attack by Gandharva and Kalakanya, and he was thoroughly defeated in his bodily strength, and thus checked by his enemies. He baffled and began to very loudly cry, Rurodaha. Right. In the purport, Srila Prabhupada explains, uh, just one second. Srila Prabhupada quotes that at the last stage of life, it's a very difficult condition, and therefore, there is all the bodily sapta dhatu, they are disarrayed, and there is a very typical sound, gur gur, that is coming from the throat. And it is very difficult to remember the Supreme Lord. And therefore, Srila Prabhupada quotes the beautiful prayer of Kurukshetra Shekara, Krishna Tvadiya Pada Pankaja Panjarantam. That, my dear Lord, your lotus feet, let Manasa Rajahamsa, let the swan of my mind get stuck into your lotus feet when I am still young. Prane Prayana Samaye Kafavata Pitte, at the time of Prana Prayana Samaye, when the Kantha Avarodhana Vidho, when the Kantha is Avarodhan, there is a Guru Guru sound in the Kantha, and Kantha is Prani Prayana Samaye. Smaranam Kutaste, where I will remember you. So Srila Prabhupada writes, the swan takes great pleasure in diving in the water, in being circled by the stem of the lotus flower. And here, the lotus feet of the Lord are compared to the lotus flower, and therefore, the mind should be encircling the lotus feet of the Lord when it's possible. Otherwise, there is always a chance that one may forget Krishna because of very intense pain at the time of death. But Prabhupada says, but if one is staunch enough, Krishna will remember such a devotee, right? So there are descriptions, and there are many, many instances. And recently, a couple of days back, we heard about Godbole Aji in, here very next to us, just our own NVCC congregation, 10 feet from my house, their houses, right? So Krishna takes care of his devotees, even if, so one has to become a good devotee, and then Krishna will take care. Text 16. Druhuta putra pautrascha jamijamrituparshadan svatva avashishtam kinchet gruhakosha parichadam. Translation.
King Puranjana then began to think of his daughters, sons, grandsons, daughters-in-law, sons-in-law, servants, and other associates, as well as his house, his household paraphernalia, and his little accumulation of wealth. Purport: it is not infrequent for a person overly attached to the material body to request a physician to prolong his life, at least for some time. If the so-called scientific physician is able to prolong one's life for a few minutes, through the use of oxygen or other medicines, he thinks that he is very successful in his attempts, although ultimately the patient will die. This is called the struggle for existence. At the time of death, both patient and physician still think of prolonging life, although all the constituents of the body are practically dead and gone.
Yeah, so now the final moments of King Puranjan, they arrived. And in the previous verse, Narad Muni is saying, Rajan, my dear Prachin Barhi, he began to think of all the near and dear ones, and all the paraphernalia, furniture, house, his daughters. So it begins with daughter, because daughter is very dear to father, and it is always in the mind. Daughter is always in the mind of the father. Daughters, sons. So first comes daughters, right? Then grandsons, daughters-in-law, sons-in-law, servants. In the purport, Srila Prabhupada explains, it is quite frequently seen that people requesting prolong my life at least by some time. And Prabhupada writes that they will use some oxygen or other medicines to prolong their life, giving the mask, ICU, and everything else. But ultimately, the person has to die, and this is called as struggle for existence. So at the time of death, instead of thinking of Krishna, both patient and physician, they are still thinking of prolonging the life. And thus, this is how the Puranjan was also doing the same. Text 17. Aham mameti svikritya gruheshu kumatir gruhi dadhyu pramadayadino viprayoga upasthite. Translation.
King Punanjana was overly attached to his family and comp- co- conceptions of I and mine. Because he was overly attached to his wife, he was already quite poverty stricken. At the time of separation, he became very sorry. Purport. It is clear in this verse that at the time of death, thoughts of material enjoyment do not go away. This indicates that the living entity, the soul, is carried by the subtle body, mind, intelligence, and ego. Due to false ego, the living entity still wants to enjoy the material world, and for want of material enjoyment, he becomes sorry or sad. He still makes intellectual plans to further his existence, and therefore, although he gives up the grass body, he is carried by the subtle body to another grass body. The transmigration of the subtle body is never visible to material eyes. Therefore, when one gives up the gross body, we think that he is finished. Plans for material enjoyment are made by the subtle body, and the gross body is instrument for enjoying these plans. Thus, the gross body can be compared to the wife, for that wife is the agent for all kinds of sense gratification. Because of long association with the gross body, the living entity becomes very sad to be separated from it. The mental activity of the living entity obliges him to accept another gross body and continue his material existence. The Sanskrit word "sri" means expansion. Through the wife, one expands his various objects of attraction: sons, daughters, grandsons, and so on. Attachment to family members becomes very prominent at the time of death. One often sees that just before the leaving his body, a man may call for his beloved son to give him charge of his wife and other paraphernalia. He may say, "My dear boy, I am being forced to leave. Please take charge of family affairs." He speaks in this way, not even knowing his destination. Thank you, Prabhu.
Yeah. So King Puranjan was Gruheshu Kumatir Gruhi. He was extremely attached to family and Aham Mameti Svikritya, very overly attached to the concept of I and mine. Because he was overly attached to his wife, he has already become poverty stricken and thus he became very sorry. So poverty stricken here means he became Krupana. And wife means the intelligence, the material intelligence. Again, okay, let's come back to the original allegory. Puranjan is the Jivatma, and here the wife is the material intelligence. In the purport, Srila Prabhupada explains that it is clear from this verse that at the time of death, thoughts of material enjoyment do not go away. There is story of Akbar and Birbal that, and and all these stories of Akbar and Birbal are actually the stories of Tenali Ram and Krishna Dev Rai. So Tenali Ram Krishna Dev Rai stories when they traveled from south to north under the powerful influence of the the left liberal government, they became Akbar Birbal stories. But if you read Akbar Nama and other authentic literatures of contemporary to Akbar's time, there is no mention of such kind of happenings. Although Akbar, now they are accepted that he was good, but he was also cunning. This is the latest NCRT explanation of Akbar. So here the king, he was having a question, and the minister he said, no, no, there is no question. This attachment for Kama and Krodha will never go away, even up to point of death. And then the king was not believing, and they said that, I will let us go to the house of a very old man. And they went to the house of very old man. He was unable to open his eyes also. And then, when he was unable to open his eyes, Birbal said, "Oh, here the great king Akbar has come." But he was unable to hear, unable to open his eyes. He was just saying, nothing. And then suddenly, one, the Rajakanya began to walk with her, the ankle bells ringing around. Immediately, this man, he opened his eyes and he was just looking at her. And he looked at her for the entire passage to pass and unable to his head again back to the original position. So it is misnomer to think that the thoughts of sense gratification will go away at the time of death. When they go away, when we follow Varnashram system very nicely, then they will surely go away. Just like we see in the case of our own parents, they're quite detached, right? Although they may not be exposed to such a great uh, depth of Krishna consciousness or Bhagavad Gita Bhagavatam, but still, at least from this perspective, if we follow Varnashram very well, the thoughts of sense gratification will eventually go away, and they will more solidly go away when we are engaged in devotional service of the Supreme Lord. So intelligence means various plans, and it is the subtle body which is making the plans, and gross body is just like the agent or the instrument to execute the plans, right? And therefore, here the gross body is compared to wife, Stri, and Prabhupada said the Stri means expand. So one will expand one's field of activities with association of Stri, and thus the attachment to family members becomes very prominent eventually, right? And then what to speak of at the, and of course for Stri it is Purusha, right? Because everybody is a Purusha ultimate end, and the expansion is through Stri, right? The Kshetra Kshetrajna and Puranjan and the intelligence, that's what we are seeing here. And thus, at the time of death, one may think that I have to still continue taking care, and one may go away in such a situation, baffled by the material existence. This is, needless to say, this is not to minimize, the taking responsibility aspect of one's life. So, what Bhagavatam is describing is only material responsibility is not enough, which is the basic minimum, bare mandatory. But beyond taking the basic responsibility, one has to cultivate that for which the human life is awarded, and that is Krishna Prema, or the love of Godhead, which is not possible in other forms of life. So one should not conclude untimely that it is all Maya, and I do not want to get stuck in Maya. My wife is Maya, my children are Maya. That is absolutely not the case. Okay, time and again we have discussed that Bhagavad Gita paradigm is the basis of Bhagavatam paradigm. So when we hear Bhagavatam, we do not nullify Bhagavad Gita. Correct. Text 18. लोकान्तरं गतवती मय्यनाथा कुटुम्बिनी वर्तिष्यते कथं त्वेषा बालकानान् अनुशोचति. Translation.
King Puranjana was anxiously thinking, alas, my wife is encumbered by so many children. When I pass from this body, how will she be able to maintain all these family members? Alas, she will be greatly harassed by thoughts of family maintenance. But all these thoughts of one's wife indicate that the king was overly engrossed with the thoughts of woman. Generally, a chaste woman becomes a very obedient wife. This causes a husband to become attached to his wife, and consequently, he thinks of his wife very much at the time of death. This is a very dangerous situation, as is evident from the life of King Puranjana. If one thinks of his wife instead of Krishna at the time of death, he will certainly not return home back to Godhead, but will be forced to accept the body of a woman and thus begin another chapter of material existence.
So in this case, Puranjan began to lament, and he was thinking that when I die, when I depart, the wife will be encumbered with so many children, and she has to maintain all these family members. How she will do that? And thus, he was greatly harassed by the thought of family maintenance. And therefore, term insurance is very important. Okay, how the term insurance comes in Bhagavatam. But the point is, the term insurance is called as, it is not the life insurance, it is the income insurance. And therefore, devotee has, and these are the the natural thoughts of even of a devotee who is dying, and therefore one should have a good amount of term insurance, so that at least when the person goes away, at least the maintenance of the family is taken care by. Of course, one cannot replace a person, but at least one can replace the income. Okay, coming back to Bhagavatam. Srila Prabhupada describes in the purport that generally a chaste woman conquers the mind of the husband just like a chaste devotee conquers the mind of the Supreme Lord. And automatically, the husband becomes extremely attached to the wife. And if the wife is a devotee, then that attachment is considered very good because she will guide the husband to the path of devotional service. Otherwise, simply engaged in sense gratification, yam yam vapi smaran bhavam, what will happen is one will be forced to accept another body, and in this case, the body of woman, as the chapter itself says, Puranjan becomes a woman in the next life. So again, this is applicable to all. So in Bhagavatam, typically, the wife becoming attached to husband is considered as still okay. Actually, everybody should become attached to the Supreme Lord. Mad bhava bhavitaha. But still, because the male form, there is, the greater chances of performing tapasya. From that perspective, it is. Of course, the greatest of the devotees and the greatest of all the devotees is ultimately Srimati Radharani, who is the female god. But in a sadhaka level, so this is the consideration. But these considerations are not so much for the devotees of the Lord who can serve the Supreme Lord in any and every condition. Right. And devotee becoming attached also has the tag of he's becoming attached to Vaishnava and caring, and his thoughts are for Vaishnava Seva. So that element is also there. So Lord is excessively partial towards the devotees. Right. There is a beautiful description where Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur writes, he asks a question. He says, whether the Lord impartially partial towards the devotee or partially impartial to the devotees. Okay. So whether the Lord is impartially partial or partially impartial. And we will take this question tomorrow. Okay, text 19. Namaya nashite bhungte nasnate snati matpara mai rushte susantrastra bharsite yat vagbhayat. Translation.
King Puranjana then began to think of his past dealings with his wife. He recalled that his wife would not take her dinner until he had finished his, and this and that sorry that she would not take her bath until he had finished his, and that she was always very much attached to him, so much so that he would sometimes become angry and chastise her. He would simply remain silent and tolerate his misbehavior. Purport: a wife is always supposed to be submissive to her husband. Submission, mild behavior, and subservience are qualities in a wife which make a husband very thoughtful of her. For family life, it is very good for a husband to be attached to his wife, but it is not very good for spiritual advancement. Thus, Krishna consciousness must be established in every home. If a husband and wife are very much attached to one another in Krishna consciousness, they will both benefit because Krishna is the center of their existence. Otherwise, if the husband is too much attached to his wife, becomes a woman in his next life. The woman being overly attached to her husband becomes a man in her next life. Of course, it is an advantage for a woman to become a man, but it is not at all advantageous for the man to become a woman. Thank you.
So here, the king Puranjan then began to think the past dealings, and he recalled that how his wife would wait for his dinner, would wait for the bath, preparing everything, and even if he became excessively angry, unreasonably angry, and how she tolerated, and this is how she tolerated his misbehavior. So it is said in the marriage, one who tolerates first 5 years, he rules the remaining 35 years. So this is how one of the Murphy's law is. In the purport, Srila Prabhupada explains, wife is always supposed to be submissive to her husband. Especially submission, mild behavior, and subservience are the qualities. Qualities of a wife towards husband and qualities of husband towards wife as well. qualities of disciple towards the guru, qualities of the employee towards the employer. These are the feminine qualities which make other personality very, very considerate, and one can actually, devotees exhibiting these characteristics can actually control the Supreme Lord. Okay, so these are the greatness of such wonderful qualities. Srila Prabhupada says best is husband and wife, they establish Krishna consciousness in their house and they become attached to Krishna, and that will, pave the path for both of their, the greater destination. So we will conclude here and continue tomorrow. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.
Jai.
Gaurav
Thank you, Prabhupada.
Thank you,
very
Prabhu.
much.
Thank you,
Thank
Prabhu.
you, everyone.
Thank
Hare
you.
Thank you,
Krishna.
Prabhupada. Hare
Thank you,
Krishna.
Prabhuji.
Hare
Thank you,
Krishna.
Prabhupada. Thank you, Prabhuji. Thank you, everyone. Hare Krishna.
Thank you,
हरे कृष्ण
Prabhupada.
प्रभु
Thank
जी
you.
हरे एक प्रश्न कृष्ण होता दंडवत प्रणाम
Thank you, Prabhuji. Hare Krishna.
Thank
हरे
you,
कृष्ण प्रभु
Prabhupada.
जी
Thank you, Prabhuji.
Thank
Hare
you,
Krishna.
Prabhuji. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
प्रभु जी एक
Thank you,
प्रश्न
Prabhu.
होता
Thank you, Prabhupada. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Hare.
Go ahead, go ahead.
प्रभु जी in that last line it was mentioned it is not advantageous for man to become woman म्हणजे म्हणजे काय woman ला कमी लेखलं गेलंय काय काय समजलं नाही I didn't get
Yeah,
that part.
so that's what we were discussing in the previous purport. So, this is, here the man and woman is about Jivatma and the intelligence. That is the first understanding. Second is that, if you see the spiritual path, because one is supposed to perform Yajna, Dana, and Tapa, and especially Tapasya. And, the male form is more suitable for Tapasya than the female form, simply being the delicate. Okay. So there is, this is the consideration on the sadhaka level. That's what we were discussing. But the greatest devotees of the Lord, they are, in the feminine form, especially, the Radharani, Sita Devi, Lakshmi. So the best of the service can be rendered, in the feminine form to the Supreme Lord. So there is no question of, Prabhupada writes this in the very first canto. Now the discussion is with respect to Puranjan. Therefore, the discussion is taking this turn. Srila Prabhupada writes that women are the most intelligent because they very quickly surrender to the Supreme Lord. Right? That is one. Second very important thing is in the Vedic, parlance, sometimes the language may be harsh, but the treatment is super excellent. It is only the Vedic religions where you will find Devata, Devi, right? You have, Sita Mata, you have Lakshmi, you have Durga, you have Radharani, you have picture of Lord Krishna, falling at the feet of Radharani. In other religions, there is no question of the female god. This absolutely doesn't exist. So one should not go by the language of, at times, a typical grandfather whose language is bit unsophisticated, but the treatment is very generous. So at times, the Vedic civilization, Vedic understanding is like this. The language may be slightly, it may appear harsh if we hear this without context, but the treatment of the ladies in the Vedic paradigm is the most excellent. And it is most exemplified by Lord Shiva, where he is falling at the feet of Radharani. And, there's Mana Leela and Dana Leela that we have heard in Vrindavan. Correct?
Okay. So there is nothing wrong even if a man takes next form of life as a woman, right?
Is there anything wrong? In Kali Yuga, and especially by the mercy of Srila Prabhupada, previous ages, it was actually the husband was initiated and wife was supposed to follow husband, even up to Srila Prabhupada. But Srila Prabhupada opened doors of, the flood of Krishna Prema, that now even women also can be initiated. They also can be Brahman initiated, which was literally unheard of in any of the Orthodox or even Vaishnava societies.
Okay.
Right. So in ISKCON especially, there is absolutely, now you may see like this, Prabhupada writing the purport like this, but Srila Prabhupada is the only Acharya, and let me emphasize on the word only here, where he constituted initiation to the ladies, which was not there, in any of the sampradaya. Husband is initiated and wife is supposed to follow husband. He constituted Brahman initiation to the ladies so that they can do the deity worship. Again, it is not there in any of the sampradaya. But Srila Prabhupada, constituted this, and we have to keep this context in mind also. Right?
Thank you.
Thank you, Prabhupada. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Thank you, Prabhupada. Thank you, Prabhupada. Hare Krishna.